Hello and welcome to a deck profile for the standard format for Cardfight Vanguard. This time we're talking about Varga, one of my favorite Dragon Empire decks and one of my favorite decks of all time. Uh, this is probably my most played deck alongside Shiranui. Uh, it's a very aggressive beatdown deck that hits big numbers and does a lot of drive checks and puts the opponent under a lot of pressure, often forcing them to have multiple perfect cards to survive. Uh, On top of that, because a lot of its rear guards retire themselves and draw a card, you can also deny your opponent targets for retire effects, deny them attacks to try to damage deny you, and can turn off effects like Dominate from Shiranui by giving them no targets. And it often just forces your opponent to have multiple perfect guards or just be dead because the attack power of this deck is so high and so efficient that they simply either have to just have all the shield value or all the PGs or just hope you don't hit any crits, or they can just lose the game on the spot. On top of that, it's also a very well-positioned deck. It's got a bunch of decent matchups in the format. It's continued to put up strong results in Japan, being one of the most topping decks in the format, even well into the set 4 meta. So this is a really good deck to pick up and play for the next half a year at least, and possibly even longer if it continues to get support after set 4. And it'll serve you well if you really like playing the aggressive, high-pressure playstyle. I think it's up there with Shoujo Doji and Shiranui as the top 3 decks of the meta right now in Japan, and I expect that we'll see a similar transfer of that meta onto the global meta in the English format. So if any of that I've said sounds appealing, this is a really good deck to pick up. But without any further ado, let's get into the ride line. First off, we're playing just a generic D starter. It could be anything. This deck doesn't require a specific one. Then the grade 1. This is Blaze Ember Dragon. When this is rode over by Boulder Axe, you can call this card to R and Soul Charge 1, and then when you're on Varga as your Vanguard, it's a 10k card. So this gives you access to grade 1 beatdown when you're going first, and you ride over this, you can call this out and then attack with it into your opponent's grade 1 Vanguard and pressure them really hard. It's a 10k booster, which is really good for hitting specific numbers in the late game, and at the end of the day, because it's a free card that calls itself, we're also fine using this as a front row attacker on the Varga turn and letting it die, or calling over it if need be. It just generates a little bit of value, gives us a little bit of additional pressure. If you don't want to play this card, you could play the Virgilla ride line instead, but I think this is slightly better. And then next up we have Boulder Axe Dragon on grade 2. When this is rode upon by Varga, you call this card R. And then when it attacks a Vanguard, if your Vanguard is a grade 3 or greater Varga, it retires itself at the end of battle and draws a card. It also gets 5k. So this just gives you some additional pressure riding up without spending any additional cards. It retires itself and replaces itself with a card in hand after it attacks, so that means that your Varga effect will be asymmetrical. You'll be gaining a card or staying card neutral, and your opponents will be losing their front row. And it just hits some good numbers. With an 8k behind it, it hits 23, which is a perfect number to hit over opponent's defensive when they're on grade 3. And then next up we have Varga, but I will use the one in the deck to read off of because this one is in this fancy case. Varga is a really strong Vanguard with a really powerful Divine Skill. What it does is when it attacks a Vanguard, you counterblast 1 and retire both players' front rows, and then this unit gets 10k, and at the end of the battle, it stands itself and gives itself drive -2. And then the Divine Skill is at the end of the battle, it attacked a grade 3 or greater unit. If the opponent's damage zone has 4 or more cards, and this unit has attacked at least twice, you counterblast 1 and you stand this unit and it gets drive +2, essentially regaining twin drive. This 23, 33 on Persona Ride, is a really good number to hit because it makes the opponent have to guard with really awkward numbers to pass this Vanguard. And they really don't want a 1 to pass this, because then if you hit 1 crit, they're just dead usually. These numbers are really efficient, and the front row retire seems symmetrical at first, but many of our cards either generate a card or otherwise stay in play, and thus we break the symmetry of this board wipe, and we're usually only wiping our opponent's stuff, and our board is staying strong. This card is susceptible to damage denial. If the opponent is paying close attention to how much CB you're going to need on the next turn, they can start attacking your rear guards and deny you that. But that's where cards like Boulder Axe Dragon are really strong, because they deny your opponent targets to attack and force them to either give up attacks or attack your vanguard. On top of that, because of a card we're playing later, that's not going to be as big of a problem as it used to be for this deck. But for now, we'll proceed with the deck profile. We're playing the full 3 copies of Varga to make sure we can Persona Ride as much as possible. Persona Ride is really important for this deck because it helps us hit really good numbers. We can hit 33s and 43s really easily with Persona Ride, and that will make our opponent's life living hell. Then next up is our other grade 3, Obduracy Glaive Dragon. This grade 3 can't be retired by card effect when it's our turn, and it's in the front row, it gets 10k, but it has to be the only copy of itself in the front row. So generally you only want one of these a game, but if it's in the back row and you have a Varga Vanguard, this unit gets boost, which can help with attacking with some of our grade 2 units like Boulder Axe Dragon and another unit we'll see later to help them hit efficient numbers, and is just a good way to use additional copies of this that you drew. It can also be good when we know we're not going to really need to stack triggers on anything after the Vanguard swing, and thus we can call this as a booster behind the Boulder Axe to make it hit a magic number, and then on a future turn we can move this to the front row, making sure that it's shielded from the opponent attacking it by doing it that way, and then we can have this as a threatening attacker on our Divine Skill turn. We're only playing 3 copies though, because this card isn't very good at multiples. Next up is our grade 2s, and we're playing 4 copies of Dragres Fallheart. This is the Energy Cycler, a staple card for the standard format right now for every nation. When you discard this for Ride, you can Counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3 and draw a card, and when you guard with this, you can also do that, which is really important in the late game because it can help us hit very specific guard numbers while preserving cards in hand. And then also, if you place this on R and a Persona of this turn, you can Counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3, and you can call a grade 1 from your drop that doesn't have Sentinel to the back row. That effect is surprisingly useful because we play a lot of grade 1s that retire themselves and draw a card, and thus we can get additional cards out of this, and this is a card that we don't really care about dying to Varga's effect after we attack with the Vanguard. Next up is our other primary grade 2. This is Dragres Shura. This is our multi-attack enabler. This card, when it attacks, we can Energy Blast 2 and give it 5k, and we pick a unit, and when that unit retires, we can add that unit back to hand. So it has a lot of synergy with Boulder Axe and our grade 1s, generating extra value for us. In addition, when it's retired by our Vanguard skill, we can Counterblast 1 and call it from drop, and it gets 10k. So after wiping our front row, we can call this back and essentially have another attacker that we can put triggers on, and it'll also be bigger than it was before. This other effect will also be reset, so we can Energy Blast 2 again if we have extra energy in order to buy back another grade 1. And we can sequence that so that we get 2 grade 1s back with this effect pretty easily if we're being careful. However, this does cost Counterblast and thus is not really usable multiple times. I generally will get 1, maybe 2 Shura activations per game. So feel free to discard any additional copies you draw, and I often mulligan this card away or discard it to Ride just because it can be awkward, and it also requires the opponent to be on grade 3, so going first, it's not the best card. But it does give you your highest power ceiling turn, and can hard punish opponents who don't know how to play against Varga and don't know how to damage control you. Next up is Boulder Axe Dragon. We're playing 3 copies because we're playing 1 in the Ride line, we can't play 4. This is a somewhat mediocre card, but it plays an important role. 15k, and it retires itself and draws a card, as I mentioned before, and this gives us slightly better odds of grade 2 rushing our opponent by playing these copies, and if we get 2 of these, we can essentially retire our entire front row and not lose anything to Varga that we care about. Next up is our grade 1s, and we're going to start with Impale Horn Dragon. This is a 15k booster when it's boosting Varga specifically, and it's a 13k booster otherwise. And when it boosts to Varga, at the end of the battle, you can Soul Blast 1, retire this, and draw a card. So this card is really strong for continuing to smooth out our draws to make sure we can survive our opponent's counterattack on their turn. It synergizes, again, really well with Shura because we can pick it back up after retiring it, and then we can play it again. And the fact that it's a 15k booster means that Varga is hitting for at least 38 with no triggers and no Persona Ride if we boost with this, and 48 if we've hit a trigger or we've used Persona Ride. So that can make the opponent's guarding really awkward. If you know they don't have a perfect guard, you can make it really hard for them to 2 to pass your Varga. Uh, and you can also use this to make the no drive swing, the second attack, really threatening as well. So then you can force your opponent to play around the mystery of drive checks, the first attack, and then the huge number, the second attack, and then the mystery of drive checks again, the third attack on the divine skill attack. And then next we have Dragres or Mid-Hat. This is a grade 1 that retires itself and draws a card when your unit stands. So when our Vanguard uses its skill, essentially, this will retire itself and draw a card. So important to note that if you call this behind the Vanguard, you need to boost on the first Vanguard swing because this will retire on the restand and you won't get to use it on the later swings. But the fact that it retires itself and draws a card and is a grade 1 is really good. The more grade 1s we play, the more likely we are to be able to call 2 grade 1s on turn 1 going second and aggro our opponent, or call 2 grade 1s on turn 2 going first. Next up is Rokusei. This card is a relatively new addition from set 2. And on place, it turns off intercepts for the turn, which is really important because Varga retires the front row, so your opponent is often encouraged to intercept really aggressively and preserve cards in hand because they're going to lose those units anyways. So this forces them to not be able to do that, and it has a similar effect of this. When a unit in the same column is retired, this retires itself and you draw a card. So either your Boulder Axes or your own units retiring from Varga, or their units retiring in the same column, will trigger this and you'll get a draw card. You will almost never miss this effect if you play correctly. So it's basically just another copy of Mid-Hat, essentially, in that regard. And again, because we're playing so many grade 1s that retire and draw, our deck can really smooth itself out and draw the pieces it needs on the next turn. And it gives us more likely chances of leaving a board with no units for Shiranui to dominate in that matchup, which means that we can pretty aggressively ride up against Shiranui and pressure them really hard with Varga, and then their first stride is going to be terrible. And then we have our PGs, just 3 copies of any of the Dragon Empire PGs that have the effect of when your hand has 2 or more cards, you discard a card, because sometimes this will be your last card and it'll save you. And then 1 copy of Elementaria, because it's still the best PG in the game, and there are still decks that are susceptible to Blitz Orders versus Sentinels, and also Luard is technically still a deck, and Chronojet is getting a comeback now with set 3. And then lastly, we have Radiance Caliburn. You can also play the Persona Ride order, which I think is called Gracious Gradale. Both of those are good in this deck, but I'm currently playing this because it denies our opponent's counterplay a little bit easier. What this card does is when you play it, you perform one of the following effects. You either draw 2 cards or you put this into Soul and Countercharge. And we're generally looking at using this for the Countercharge effect. To do our maximum power turn with Varga on turn 4 with a Persona Ride, let's say, and a Shura, we need to Counterblast to activate Varga to retire the front row. We need to Counterblast to call Shura, and then we need to Counterblast again to activate Divine Skill. So we need 3 CB to do our highest power ceiling turn. And that can be difficult to pull off if the opponent knows that, because they're going to purposely leave you at 2 CB or less. Preferably, they'll leave you at 1 or 0 CB from their perspective. But if your opponent is damage denying you, you can hard punish them by ambushing them with a countercharge they didn't know about was in your deck. Because most versions of this deck are playing the Persona Rite order as of the last time I checked. And then next up is the Trigger lineup. We are playing 4 of this vanilla crit and 4 of this other vanilla crit. The deck doesn't use that much soul. The only card that costs soul, really, is Impalehorn Dragon, which is just Soul Blast 1, retire and draw. So we should never run out of soul as long as we're Persona riding, and that means that the Burning Flail Dragon, I think it's called, has no value to us, really. And the plus 2k isn't really relevant for any attacker except... No, it doesn't matter for anything. None of the numbers... except for specifically boosting a Boulder Axe or a Shura with the grade 1 from our ride line for 10k, that would be a 25, but even then it only gets to a 27, which I think still doesn't hit a magic number. So there's no benefit to playing Burning Flail, but the 5k from a trigger might matter over the 4k, because again, if you're boosting a Glaive Dragon that's a 13k plus 10 for 23, and then you boost with a crit to make it 28, that hits a magic number. Sometimes you'll call this in front of one of your grade 1s that retires a card, and then that'll be a 13 column or 23 on Persona Ride, which is a better number than would be 12 or 22. So the 5k triggers do matter, and these are also cheaper, I think, because you can just get whatever vanilla triggers you want. And then next up we have the heals. Currently playing 2 restand heals and 2 vanilla heals. You can play the crit heal if you want. That'll improve your matchup against Blangdemeyer and against Luard and against Zorga, whereas this will improve your matchup against Shiranui, against the Mirror, and a few other decks. But with Shoujo Doji entering the format, Shoujo Doji is not a deck that has natural crit or natural restanding, and so there is not really a benefit to playing either heal. Rezael is another deck. There's no benefit to playing either heal. Equilibra will restand when that comes out in set 4, but Equilibra will also hit such big numbers that this might not save you. So you could argue for playing 4 vanillas, and the crit heal will matter more against Zorga than this, because this will only work on their Divine Skill turn for Zorga. At the end of the day, I would never play more than 2 effect heals, and there's nothing wrong with playing 4 vanilla heals or 3 vanilla heals and 1 effect heal, of whichever one you like. And then next we have our draw triggers. 3 draws. You can play fronts in this deck in theory, but because Varga retires the front row, you often will have a turn where you're getting 0 value out of your fronts, and you're just giving 10k to Varga, essentially. If you have Shura and Glaive Dragon, you can have a full board after your Vanguard attacks, and thus get the maximum value from fronts. But that's not going to happen very often, and so it doesn't really matter most of the time, but these draws will help you find pieces. They'll be better to hit defensively in the early game, and you will basically never have to worry about deck out in this. I don't think I've ever decked out with Varga, even once. You will die or your opponent will die first, so the draw thinning your deck isn't really a downside that you have to worry about, and these will be slightly better defensively, so I think you should just play draws. And then next up we have the OT. I'm playing the blue OT. The Dragon Empire OT, while extremely powerful, is unfortunately a non-combo with this deck. Because Varga's ability to restand itself is activated at the beginning of its battle, then if you hit the Dragon Empire OT on the first Vanguard swing, you will already have an effect standing your Vanguard and giving your Vanguard drive -2, which will then, you'll basically just get no benefit from the Dragon Empire OT if you hit it on that drive check. However, if you hit it on the Divine Skill, you can get a 4th Vanguard attack with full drives, which is very good. And you can theoretically get value out of it if you hit it without activating Divine Skill, which you will almost never do unless you're being hard damage denied. So there's some corner cases where the Dragon Empire OT is better, but in practice, this one is just going to be better most of the time. It'll help you pick up a Perfect Guard, or pick up Persona Ride, or anything you need, rear guards that retired themselves to draw. And the crit matters a lot, because if you hit the crit on Varga's first swing, and let's say they 2 to past your Vanguard, they're going to immediately take 2 and probably go to 4. And going to 4 is a really good spot for them to be in, because it activates your Divine Skill. So this having a crit attached to it is extremely threatening in this deck specifically. So play the blue OT, in my opinion. So that's the main deck. Let's go over some of those more common attack patterns and mulligans. For mulligans, you're generally looking to find the Energy Cycler, 1 copy of Shura, Persona Ride is really important, and then you want the rest of your hand to essentially be grade 1s. The reason for that is because this deck really wants to call a full front row on the first turn it can attack and pressure the opponent as hard as possible. Now, if you're going first, that's a little bit easier, because riding Boulder Axe will call this grade 1 from Soul and Soul Charge 1, meaning that you only need 1 more grade 1 to get 3 attacks on your first turn that you're allowed to attack. If you do draw Impalehorn, it might be tempting to call this as an attacker because you get the better rush, but it's probably better to call it behind the Vanguard, because that's where it's going to need to be on the Varga turn. So even though you would get 1 fewer attack, this attack would be impossible for the opponent to easily 2 to pass, and thus they will probably no guard it and open themselves up to critting them. So it can often provide more pressure than if it were another attacker. It'll also make you slightly insulated against defensives when you're going first, because if your opponent hits a trigger, they'll go to 18, and this will still hit. Because we are trying to get our opponent to 4, though, as fast as possible, it is really important to try to get that set up where you have 3 attacks. And if you're going first, then you'll want to even do, you'll still want to do something like this, or you'll want to have the other grade 1. I mentioned that this card turns off intercepts when you're on the Varga turn, but this early rush is important enough that I'm willing to give up the intercept restrict in order to get the 3 attacks early. And then we just want energy cyclers in order to discard to ride without losing any cards from hand, because we'll draw a card from it. Sorry, my cat is jumping on my desk and shaking the tripod. Copies of Boulder Axe Dragon are not super high priority to mulligan for. They're nice to have, but you can even discard them to ride if you don't have a cycler, because you're going to get one from Soul when you ride up to Varga anyways. Obduracy Glaive Dragon being a grade 3 is also not great to keep in your starting hand, because it will restrict your ability to aggro your opponent early, and you can't guard with this early. Which brings me to my next topic of guarding early. Varga can play for low early damage, and it can also play to ignore guarding early. Both of those strategies are viable. If you take damage aggressively, you're turning off your opponent's heals, while also giving yourself plenty of counterblast to use on your Varga turn. But if you guard aggressively, you're guaranteeing that you'll survive to your Persona Ride Divine Skill turn at a healthy damage amount. However, you do expose yourself to potentially being damage denied. So knowing what your opponent's deck does and their playstyle is going to matter a lot for deciding which of those routes you go. But personally, I think it's fine to guard early swings and only take 1 or 2 damage. Try to keep yourself roughly on damage parity with your opponent so that you're able to heal or you're able to deny their heals if you can take 1 more damage than they did. Your opponent probably will be scared of Varga. I mean, they're going to know what the deck does. It's a very popular deck, so they might guard aggressively early, and thus you can sort of deny them access to heals if you're willing to take 1 or 2 damage early. And that can be really strong. The worst case scenario for you is that your opponent goes to their turn 3 while they're at 4 damage, and then they double heal, and then you're never getting your Divine Heal off, and then they kill you on their next turn. So you really gotta, so keeping yourself close to their damage is good, but you can do something like staying at 1 damage if you know your opponent is themselves playing a really powerful aggro deck as well. Because this deck draws so many cards, it's actually fairly resilient in the aggro mirror. You're really good at finding your perfect cards because so many of your cards retire themselves and draw, and you do 2 drive checks on your first attack, and then on your Persona Red turn, you're usually doing at least 4 drive checks, meaning that if you're going first, it's often pretty doable to survive your opponent's Persona Ride turn and then kill them on your second Persona Ride. So Varga has the ability to play a grindy game as well as play an aggressive beatdown game fairly well, which is one of the reasons why it's one of the best decks in the format, in my opinion. And so now we'll cover the common attack patterns. You've got your grade 1 rush patterns, but then you've also got this pattern where you have Varga and then either a Boulder Axe or a Shura. I would use Boulder Axe if I'm not on Persona Ride, and if I'm on Persona Ride and my opponent's on grade 3, I would play Shura. And then you do something like attack here, give the grade 1 here the ability to come back to my hand, and then you could swing with Vanguard, tire this, call it back with Counterblast, restand, retire this draw, and swing again. If you have the energy to spare, you can do something like swing, boosted, give this unit the ability to return to your hand, swing Vanguard, retire this, call it back again for Counterblast, retire this when Varga restands a draw, return it to your hand instead, and then swing here again and give Impale Horn Dragon the ability to return to hand when it's retired, swing Vanguard boosted, Soul Blast, retire this draw, put this back in your hand, and then stand with Divine Skills, swing again, put all your triggers over here, and then attack. That can be a really potent pattern. Also, if you have multiple Glaive Dragons, you can do something like this, where this is now getting +5 from its skill, and then 13k booster for 28. Or if you're not on Persona Ride, it can be a Boulder Axe Dragon swinging for 28. If you're on Persona Ride, this number would be 38. My bad. But this column here is really good, especially if you have something like double Boulder Axe. You can have a board of like Boulder Axe, Mid-Hat, Impale Horn, something like this. And then you can call this the back row. Swing here for 23, retire this draw. Swing here for 28, retire this draw. Swing here unboosted, restand, retire this draw. Swing boosted, retire this draw. If you went second and they're at 4 damage now, you can counterblast and restand and swing again for twin drive. Or you can just pass, and then on the next turn, you can move this up. As you see, you can squeeze a lot of value out of all your cards, and your numbers will be really good. Basically, if you assemble a full board out of any combination of cards, even if you're doing things like calling this and then calling a grade 1 from it behind the Vanguard on a Persona Ride turn, that's still a 28k column, which is hitting magic numbers. And your opponent really wants to guard everything because they don't want to be at 4 for this. So unless they're holding multiple perfect guards, they're going to really stress out about that, and they might just have to start taking stuff and hope they hit defensives or heals. So that's the deck. Things to keep in mind are you really want to be mindful of your damage, your available counterblast, and your opponent's damage. You want to keep them out of range of heals if possible. You want to make sure that you have at least 1 or 2 CB to going into your Varga turn. Minimum 1, preferably 2. 3 would be nice if you have Shura to go for the maximum power. But at least 2 once you're going into Persona Ride, and at least 1 going into your first Varga ride. That will make sure that on your first ride you can get 1 restand, and 2 CB will ensure that you can get Divine Skill. So keep in mind those numbers, keep in mind your opponent's damage, and throw big numbers at them early, or rather throw multiple small numbers at them early, and really pressure them so that they have to sweat, and potentially you'll eat cards out of their hand, and that'll make it harder for them to kill you when they finally get to grade 3 because they'll have spent all their pieces guarding these numbers for 5k. And as a last note, when I attack on grade 1 rush, I usually go rear guard, Vanguard. Sure, you miss out on the potential of putting a trigger on another attacker and you don't get his full value out of that 10k, but getting 3 live attacks is more important in my opinion because each of these will potentially eat a card from the opponent's hand, especially if they don't hit a defensive. And if you have this booster behind your Vanguard during this pattern, this is really threatening. Usually you won't be lucky enough to get that full pattern unless you're going first and your pattern is actually something like this. Because it's really unlikely that you get exactly grade 1 in your starting hand. But if it's something like this pattern, again, hits over defensive on the Vanguard swing and also can't be easily guarded for OT to pass with 1 card. And if you hit OT with this deck, you can basically assume that you will win the game because the blue OT giving a crit will push the opponent up damage. They will have to heal multiple times if you hit early in order to get themselves out of Divine Skill range, or they will be pushed up to Divine Skill range on your grade 3 turn, and then you'll just immediately go for Divine Skill and hard and just threaten lethal on the spot. They'll be forced to have multiple perfect guards to not die to Varga with 100 million in crit. And then if you have a Glaive Dragon in your front row, when you do that, I had one out here. Yeah. If you have this in your front row and you hit OT, then any additional triggers you hit the power will go here. And then on the Divine Skill, 2 more drive checks, the power will go here. And then this will be minimum 33, but possibly 43 or 53. If you have this booster behind it, maybe even 63. So hitting the OT with Varga generally means you win. Hitting crits early on your grade 1 rush or grade 2 rush generally means that you're heavily favored to win. Hitting a crit on your first Varga swing generally means you're favored to win. And this deck also just always puts all the triggers on Vanguard when your opponent 2 to passes because you're going to restand. So even if you don't break the 2 to pass, you're getting additional value out of those triggers by swinging with them again. So you can often just still kill your opponent. If you have a Glaive Dragon, you can consider stacking the triggers over here, especially if your opponent's at low damage, because then you're not going to, or if they're not on grade 3 yet, because you're not going to get Divine Skill anyways. But this deck is really good at breaking 2 to passes because its numbers are so big, and if you do break it, you just win. So it's like usually favored to just go all on Vanguard. Uh, some other tech options you can consider playing. There's a grade 2 card that has. Let me see if I have a copy of it right here. There's a grade 2 that says when your Vanguard hits, you countercharge 1. You can just call that somewhere in the back row and leave it and wait until your Vanguard hits and you can get the countercharge. You can consider playing Defensing Roar or Jeweled Beast Gallnet, the Ride Line returner card that becomes a 20k shield. Those are all solid cards to play as like one-ofs in the deck. But aside from that, this list is basically fine-tuned, and until set 4, we don't really change any of it. The Regalis piece is a flex slot. You can play the Persona Red Regalis piece over it, but for the most part, you're just going to play this. Another card you can consider is the Cabbage Dragon. The Cabbage Dragon, if you when it's placed, you get a plant token, and then you counterblast 1, and you pick one of the 2 effects. Either units you placed by card effect get 5k, or you give your Vanguard 10k if you have 4 units. So that can be really good going second, because you can have some of the pressure as if you Persona Road. Your Vanguard will be 33k on the first swing and 48 boosted with this, which is a really awkward number for your opponent to guard or to 2 to pass. So that card is worth it, but it does cost Counterblast. So playing that can lock you out of doing your max power turn on a future turn sometimes. So it's better when you've been pushed up high damage and your plan is to try to turn 3 kill them with your Divine Skill, hoping that you can just hit a crit and sack them out of the game, because you're not going to live to your turn 4. Well, that's the deck profile. You're going to have to know either how to play this or how to play against it, no matter what, for the foreseeable future of the format. So you better study up on Varga, and you better get good at damage denial and damage control. Otherwise, you don't have much of a chance of surviving against this deck. That's the video. I hope this was fun and informative. Good luck card fighting.